of dedication to providing educational experiences to our locals and visitors, primarily through the interpretation of the seabirds, the shorebirds, raptors, marine mammals, and the rocky intertidal organisms. Care and appreciation for all the life that shares this place is at the heart of sea. We are the people that you see during the nesting season with the scopes focused on the common murres, puffins, cormorants, pigeon guillemots, black oyster catchers, peregrine falcon, and more on the rocks in the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge, specifically at Face Rock and Simpson Reef. We are soon to add interpretation at the Coquille Point Marine Garden between the 8th Street stairs and the 11th Street stairs between the low tide line and the high tide line. That is the newly designated marine garden that Sea worked to get designated as such after a lengthy process and with the support of our community and government agencies. Our other activities include the seminars here, and thank you very much, Bandon Public Library, for amazing generosity with your resources. The ongoing development of facts and identification of all the life here through the Shoreline Education for Awareness website with barcodes that you can scan that are located on the signs as you go down the stairs to the beach. Some of our volunteers help with Whale Watch in March and December, Pup Patrol, which are called Guardians of the Seal Pups, at Coquille Point Beach for a few weeks in April and May, a Puffin Party, the Nurdle Patrol, which is ongoing throughout the year, volunteer training in the spring prior to the nesting season, volunteer appreciation picnic, and the spring walk on the wild side. Please help yourself to refreshments that are over there in the corner and enjoy the presentation by Reg Pullen, whom Berta, I know it's Scandinavian sounding.
Jeez, no.
Dargan. Berta Dargan will introduce Reg.
Good morning and welcome. What a great crowd. This is wonderful. I think we're going to have to book the Sprague next time. Good. You know, my name is Berta Dargan, and I am a board member for C and a volunteer in many of those activities that she just named out. I'm also on the board of the Bandon Museum and volunteer there also. In my mind, I think there are three people in this community that we are so fortunate to have. They have a huge history and knowledge about our homes. Mary Shammerhorn is just a wealth of knowledge regarding the history. Jim Prohl, who used to be a high school teacher here in Bandon, taught English, and in his retirement, we're lucky enough to get him doing research at the Bandon Museum. And then Reg Pullen, who is a native boy, well, not a boy anymore, but born and raised in Bandon, knows the area very well, has fished all the streams, has hiked all the trails, I think, on it. Reg comes to us with a wealth of information also. He's been a cranberry farmer for 30 years. He has got his master's degree at Oregon State University in anthropology and in forest management? Fisheries management. Fisheries, big difference. Yeah, fisheries management. He has worked very closely with the Coquille tribe for years. Anything having to do with the archaeology and the anthropology with their tribe. He's a board member also for the Bandon History Museum. And I guess I would certainly consider him an expert in our area, thank heavens. He's the co-author of this book called Bandon. You might have seen it. He's co-author along with Robin Miller, yes, on it. Wonderful book. So, and he's been working for a while on another book that soon will be published, right? Everybody cross your fingers on it. So he's going to share some of his knowledge and his information with us today. So please welcome Reg Pullen.
Thank you. I think I'll just set my chair here. I was going to show slides today, but the slide projector wasn't working very well, so I think we'll just wing it. And I've done that before. And sometimes people tell me they like it better when I don't use the slides and I just talk. So that's what we'll do. You know, I've been familiar with Coquille Point for a long time. I was born here in 1950, and I started running the beach when I was 10 years old. And I ran cross country and in high school, and I went out and ran every day on that beach. And I've been running almost every day on that beach until about 10 years ago when my hips gave out. So I don't get the incredible thrill of doing that anymore, but I always considered it to be almost a religious experience to get on that beach, especially just before sunset, when all the creatures down there are getting set for the night, making all kinds of interesting sounds. There's always the smell of the beach and the seaweed. Just an incredible place. So I'm really happy to see an organization adopt that place and try to protect it. Certainly in recent years, we've seen an increased number of people on the beach. And they come in very close proximity to wildlife there at Coquille Point, as I'm sure you're all aware, especially with the seals that are birthing their pups there in the springtime. And I remember when I was in high school and college, I had a black lab dog that ran with me, and I would run on the beach and he would chase the birds resting on the beach, and I thought that was really funny to watch them jump up into the air. Now don't start throwing things at me, because that was just a sign of immaturity. But I came to realize over time that all those animals deserve respect, and if you go down to the beach, you should do it very carefully, and dogs should be on leash, and those kind of things. And you're helping to make sure that people understand that. I initially was not really excited about seeing more protection for Coquille Point, but as I've watched the number of people on the beach increase, I think that protection is appropriate. What I'll be talking about today mostly is Native American use of that particular area. It was the supermarket of the people that lived here 300 years ago, because they had no supermarkets, but they had that particular place. Throughout most of the year, there was a lot of other foods available, but in the springtime, all the dried food was used up, and people struggled to survive. And so they went to Coquille Point to gather mussels, gumboot chitons, barnacles, limpets, practically anything that lived out there in those tide pools, even including sea anemones, to keep alive until the salmon and the other fish began coming back in early summer. So it was really an important part of their life. And I wonder, and I was going to talk today about something about that. If you look at where we're at here, there aren't a lot of reefs close by. You've got Coquille Point, which is a pretty significant reef. Then you have Face Rock Reef, I call it reef. And then to the south of that, for almost 20 miles, there's nothing but sand that doesn't support much in the way of shellfish populations. And then to the north, you have sand all the way up to 5 Mile Point, where the golf course is. So you can see that if there were several hundred people living here, that there must have been some pressure on the populations of shellfish at Coquille Point. And I wonder how they managed to maintain those populations without depleting them to the point where they wouldn't have that resource available in the springtime. And there are some interesting stories about Coquille Point from a tribal perspective, and I want to read one of those today to you. It's about Grandmother Rock, which was a rock that was located right at the mouth of the river, because originally the mouth of the river flowed to the south along the edge of Coquille Point into the ocean. And it was changed in 1888 with the building of the jetties, but before that time it ran right along the base of the bluff there. And this particular rock, which today is the place for the assisted living facility down there, was right at the edge of the ocean. And a gentleman named Coquille Thompson, who was born here in 1849, told these stories about that place. So I'll read them to you. This rock we called Sausikna. It was in the ocean off the mouth of the Coquille River. Indians always prayed to this rock. There was a kind of camas growing up on top of that rock long ago, and it was gathered by women climbing up onto the rock. They cooked the camas with ashes, earthen ovens. The rock was next to the Bandon Prairie. Now there's some interesting clues here when you read this account. The Bandon Prairie was an area that extended all through this area right here to the east and to the south. And it was kept open every year by burning by the Native Americans. There were several edible root species that were gathered here. There was a kind of a white flowered camas, and I'm sure most of you have heard that white camas is death camas and not edible. But there are some varieties of camas that have an almost white flower. Now, when I first started coming out here to Coquille Point 50 years ago, or 50 or 60 years ago, there was an abundance of this camas growing here. Now there are 3 small populations of that plant. It's been almost destroyed by the development of home sites along the top of the bluff. There's also Brodea that grew here. It's a little blue flower that comes up, and it's only just a short distance above the ground. It has a beautiful flower, and it has some really tasty nutlets, clusters of about 50 of them just under the ground. And that was an important food source too. So we always think of Coquille Point as a place you go to gather shellfish, but it was also a place to dig roots as well. The Kamazdaton and Noleston were of the same language as the mouth of the Coquille River people. Those 2 villages are upriver at Bullards and Prosper. According to Norman George, Sausikna is the same as a kind of rock, medicine rock, that is located at the mouth of Smith River in northwest California. If one wants to make good weather, one picks up a beach rock and bangs on it and then throws the rock in the ocean. So anytime that you were going to go out into the ocean in your canoe, you would stop and tap on that rock for good luck. I do something like that every time I cross the Bandon Bar when I go fishing. I'm thankful when I can survive that experience. They always talked to this rock when they went by, telling her where they were going. If you don't, a bad wind will come up. This is a red rock standing on the south side of the mouth of the Coquille River. They said there was grass on top and seagulls laid eggs there. They said that rock was nice red stone. Now, if you look at some of that stone that has been blasted apart and used to build the jetties, you will notice a kind of a reddish tinge to some of that rock. The Indians used to be very strict that no one should ever remove even the smallest part of that red rock. They lived at Mechiton, which is a little bit too upstream from the sewage treatment plant. And their chief's name was Tamex. They claimed the land for 15 to 20 miles south of the Coquille River. The people would look out every morning at the red rock to see if any whales might have been stranded near it. They claimed any whales that stranded on the south side of the river, but the people of Comosdaton, who lived across the river, claimed any that is stranded on the north side. There were strict laws about the division of whales that washed up on the beach. Now, I would assume that the whale population in 1850 was, well, it could have been larger than it is today. It could have been less because there was commercial whaling taking place too. But there are large populations of whales that we see at Coquille Point. It's a good place to see whales. I heard somebody talk from your organization talking about watching the whales coming in close to the beach. A friend of mine, Rick McKenzie, who's a rancher that lives at Langlois, has observed whales coming in to the beach to feed and then getting stranded in the shallow water several times. You know, we've always said, well, the Indians here didn't hunt whales. Further north, the macaws hunted whales, but they didn't hunt whales here. I wonder if maybe they didn't hunt whales at times. Maybe whales would come up close to the beach to feed, and they would get high-centered, and a person could wade out with a harpoon or a spear and kill them. Tamex told the story of two brothers who climbed inside a whale that got stranded on their tribe's shore. Then the wind and a storm came up and they were blown out to sea, probably to the north. Later, they felt the whale rock and realized the whale may have grounded somewhere. They climbed out of the whale and saw a village nearby. Lots of people were coming down the beach from the north side with knives and ropes to cut up the whale. They hid in the brush until the people had passed and then went to the house they had come from. Inside the house were elk, beaver, and all sorts of animal hides and food, and a girl that was sleeping, pretending anyway to sleep. When they went to another house, the girl ran to get help from the intruders. The men plundered the house of valuables, including strings of dentalium, and stole one of the canoes pulled up on the beach in front of the house. They gouged holes in the other canoes and paddled out to sea. The next day, as they paddled toward shore, the ocean got rough just as they came within sight of their home village. They landed with a boat full of valuables and became very wealthy. This is a common theme. You know, we have the story of Jonah and the whale. Native Americans had stories about people ending up inside whales and then traveling to different places and then cutting their way out and escaping. The whales were a big thing. And when one washed up on the beach, that meant that there was a lot of excellent fat, blubber, that would be available for everybody, and it was shared amongst all the people in the village. Probably, I'm guessing that this story is talking about the whale that washed up on the beach, probably out by Coos Bay. And the quest for wealth was always a big part of Native American life here, especially in the late historic period. And the idea that you could steal somebody else's valuables from another place and bring it home and become very wealthy was a popular idea too, although it probably didn't happen very often. We have a lot of stories about rocks on the Bandon Beach. Grandmother Rock has an interesting story. All the people in the village except the grandfather and grandmother and granddaughter went upriver to chase salmon. And when they came back, there was no sign of those three people, but there was a giant rock sticking up out of the sand. What they said was that the girl violated some of the taboos regarding eating foods at that village, and so those people were punished and turned into stone. We hear a lot about that material that is the base for Grandmother Rock. From a geological perspective, that rock is a metaschist. It's a metamorphic rock, and it was extruded from way below the surface during an earthquake activity. And there are vents that push that volcanic material up. I've always said there's no volcanic rock here, but from a geological perspective, many of the rocks on the Bandon Beach are volcanic in nature. They're especially made of schist and basalt. Both of those materials were important for tool building. And there was a major quarry right there at Coquille Point where people would come down and break off pieces of schist and make tools out of them. Make stone bowls and pestles and really some beautiful artifacts. And those people who had access to that material became quite wealthy because they traded some of that stone to villages inland or to the south where they didn't have that kind of material. So it was really a good place to live. Now I think that there was probably a pretty good sized village on Coquille Point. There are remnants of shell middens along the sides, but the bulk of Coquille Point has been bulldozed off to make, in the 1930s, there was a major resort there, a natatorium and a saltwater indoor swimming pool that we would like to have today too, but we don't seem to have much luck with that. But it was a great place for people to come and visit. And the crowds of people that would go on the beach after they'd been swimming was amazing. You look at some of the photographs. And that must have put some pressure on sea life here as well. As we work our way down the beach, there are several other rocks that have significance from an Indian perspective. Table Rock is one such rock. In the springtime, as you well know, and you watch those birds nesting out there, the common murres especially are quite abundant and leave their eggs in nests to gather. Now, as the price of eggs climbs today, maybe we'll be thinking about that too. But they would gather those eggs and then boil them, and they were an important source of food after a long winter spent without much food, probably eating dried salmon most of the time. So those eggs were really appreciated. They were appreciated to the point that the people who lived at Coquille Point would hold a celebration each spring and invite other villages to come in to share in the feast. probably every rock on the Bandon beach has a myth associated with it. I know some of the myths, I don't know all of them, but they all talk about sharing, about not being selfish with resources. The story about Face Rock is another such myth of sharing. The story of a young girl who comes to the coast with her family from the east. They were living up in the mountains, probably over toward Camas Valley, somewhere like that. And they came here for a celebration and a potlatch, a major feast and sharing. Now, the people that lived on the Bandon beach knew of the danger of going into the ocean. They had been warned repeatedly as they were growing up, don't ever go into the sea. Just like I was told when I was growing up here. And I was never a big fan of swimming in the ocean anyway, it was too damn cold. But so this young girl didn't pay much attention to the warnings. And there was an evil sea god that lived out in the ocean. And that night, as she was swimming in the ocean with her pet raccoons, the evil sea god grabbed her and turned her into stone so he could possess her forever. And that rock will always be there looking up to the north forever, or as long as forever is for us. And we don't know what that really means, but it's the Native Americans call it time immemorial. Certainly the Indians were here 15 to 20,000 years ago. And I'm sure most of you have heard the stories about how far the ocean receded during the Ice Age. And the shoreline was about 10 miles to the west of where it is today. And when we're trying to find early sites on the Oregon coast, we struggle with that because these sites are probably covered with water. We did find one early site at a place that's very dear to my heart, and that is Devil's Kitchen. I grew up playing there in that little creek as a child and partying there as a teenager. So I have a lot of memories of that place. And my grandmother told me when I was the boy that there was an Indian village near there that you could find arrowheads at. And she took me out there on the north side of Devil's Kitchen and showed me that stratum that is eroding out from the bank. And I found several arrowheads there. Later, there was an anthropologist named Lauren Davis who was trying to find early sites on the Oregon coast, and I suggested that he look at that place at Devil's Kitchen to find out how old that place was. And he came up with a date that was quite startling, 13,500 years ago, which makes it the oldest site on the West Coast. But it's only just a remnant of what was once probably extensive sites further to the west that we can't access right now. Now perhaps if we continue to go in the direction we are, looking for alternative sources of energy or oil, the drilling platforms that we build will reveal some of those sites to us. Perhaps at a high cost to the wildlife here, but perhaps a good thing for archaeology. So there is some potential there for that. There's also a really neat rock at Devil's Kitchen. It's called Fish Rock. And I used to go out there as a boy and fish for pinktail perch and greenling and other types of fish. Later I found out that the Native Americans had a story about that place. There was a young woman that came to the beach with her baby and was gathering mussels and she didn't want to carry the baby in her backpack or cradle, and so she laid it on the baby on the rock, and she went away for a little while. And she had been told to never do that. Never leave your child unattended here. But she didn't obey. And she came back, and the baby was gone. It had been washed away. And she was turned into a crow. And that's why the crows cry. They have that crying call that they make. That's because they lost their baby. So these are just some of the stories that I have been able to collect. What happened here was that in the 1930s, there were remnant populations of Native Americans here who had been basically subjected to incredible abuse throughout the course of their life, taken to reservations in northern Oregon where most of them died of starvation or disease. Some had been hung because Native Americans were not thought of as being human. There were a lot of bad things that happened. But by the 1930s, when there was just a handful of Native Americans left, all of a sudden we realized that this was a treasure, and we should try to get down and write down the stories of these people so that we could do what I'm doing today, talking about those things. I think that those stories really add a lot of value to this place. And I'm trying to find more of those stories. Most of them were recorded by people like John Harrington and Melville Jacobs, whose handwriting was not very good. And they're preserved on microfilm. And probably most of us researchers end up going blind because we spend too much time looking at that, trying to read that material, and squiggly lines and everything. But I'm still looking for stories, and I'll continue to gather them up and tell them to audiences, because I think that people enjoy hearing those stories, and they make that place really special. So the native use of the beach here was really important. And there was a limited number of reefs available here, so there was a lot of pressure on, especially during the springtime, to survive. One of the neat things that happens out there on the Bandon Beach, especially just to the south of Coquille Point, is it's a good place to dig razor clams. And some of you may have noticed people like me out there in chest waders waiting around in the springtime looking for clams. And there's another mollusk out there that lives near the razor clams. It's called an olivella shell. I don't know if any of you have ever seen those, but they're in the sand out there, and I find them all the time when I'm digging clams. And those olivella shells were used as ornaments, and they made necklaces out of the shells. And when I was digging clams when I was younger, I did gather those olivella shells and make necklaces out of them. And they're really, really beautiful shells. We don't have a lot of spectacular shells out there, but there are some sea snails and others that are pretty nice. And there was once abalone here as well. I found red abalone shells in midden sites around here. Middens are places where people threw away the things they didn't want to eat, the refuse heaps. And they built their plank houses out on these points, and then they threw the shells away as they collected the bodies of the shellfish to eat. And over time, a midden would develop that would be several feet deep. And it would be filled with the shells of sea life, the bones of marine mammals, and seabirds, and all of those things. And as an archaeologist, I find middens more interesting to look at now than artifacts, because middens can teach you a lot about changing climates and environments. One thing that I am sure of here, and that is that change is almost constant. In the course of our short lives, we may not have seen that, although I can tell you it's quite different now than it was when I was a boy here. But if you look at the last several hundred years, we've gone through cycles of drought and cycles of heavy rain. There's always change taking place out there. And when we have periods of time when it rains a lot, the coniferous forest advances and covers up a lot of the landscape. And then when the heavy rain ends and we have drought, the prairies expand. And that probably from a Native American perspective was the best thing of all, because that meant that things like oaks would grow here, and there would be acorns to harvest, and the root crops would increase greatly too. If you look at the mythology of the people here, they talk about these constant changes taking place. Periods of drought, periods of heavy rain, periods of famine. All of these things took place over the course of 13,000 years. Just think of all the stories that we destroyed when we did not listen to those people until it was almost too late, which is something that this country has been known for a long time. The buffalo was hunted until there were only a few hundred left. There are species of birds like passenger pigeons that were hunted to extinction. The Native Americans were driven to the point of extinction in a lot of places here. So I enjoy working in this field today so that I can learn about the past and learn about those stories. In the book that I'm writing, I'm trying to capture interesting stories as much as anything. When I started in the field of archaeology, I was only interested in artifacts. But as I get older, I realize that the stories of the people, just like everyone in this room has stories that they could tell me that would be interesting. And when we sit around the bar or the campfire, we hear some of those stories. Just think of all the stories that the people who lived here told us too. If you can relate to the humanness of those people, it will make them much more special to you than if you just look at them as people who left a few stone tools behind and were just primitive people. They were humans just like you and I. And I'm trying to bring them alive in my work. So I'm always digging, metaphorically speaking, for those stories. And I find them every now and then. One of the more interesting stories I found recently was a story of human abuse. We probably don't think of Indians as being abusive to each other, but they were at times. There was a chief that lived near Flores Lake who was a cruel man, and the people in his village did not like him very much. He stole from them and abused them. And he had several wives, and he liked to torture his wives. He would burn them with sticks, hot sticks, or put them in pits, try to starve them, that kind of thing. So he was not a nice man. And he married two young girls from a village on the upper Coquille River. And he took them back to his village where he treated them the same way. Now, the two girls parents heard about how he was abusing them, and they wanted to punish him for that. And they had another young daughter at home still, and they passed word to him that, well, our youngest daughter is available to you as well. If you will just come to Bandon, to the mouth of the Coquille River, we will give you this daughter. And so he came up to Bandon with a few of his followers. And when he got here, they killed him. And that's not a typical story. You don't see those written up very much, do you? But it's an important story to understand, because abuse of women occurs in all societies. And abuse of weaker people in a village occurs the same way. And they had rules about that. So I continue to search for those stories so that we can understand these people better. So as you're out there on the beach looking at the tufted puffins, which I hope will come back, I think they're probably stressed quite a bit by the red foxes that were introduced here by fur farmers in the 1930s, but they may have gotten a handle on that. That's one of the more interesting species. In Alaska, the beaks of the tufted puffin were used to make ornaments, necklaces, and that kind of thing. And that could have happened here as well. We find that the cultures here, just like the vegetation here, is very similar between here and Alaska. Recently, I've discovered that American dune grass, which grows in limited populations along the edge of the shoreline, just below Coquille Point, was a major basketry material that we didn't even know about. In Alaska today, there are all these villages that are under the ground but are frozen. And now as the climate changes and the ice is melting, archaeologists are digging in those sites and finding incredible things like perishables, like baskets and other types of things that ordinarily disappear. And that American dune grass was really an important plant up there for making, especially for cordage, ropes, and that kind of thing. And the same thing happened here. There's quite a bit of American dune grass out at Redmond Pond, around, on the South Jetty. But it's a species that is not very common anymore. The tribes here now are identifying plants that have cultural significance. And that American dune grass is one. Trying to restore those populations. I hope that white camas that grows out on Coquille Point in just a few spots now, a little bit on the South Jetty too, can be preserved as well. Because when you become an archaeologist now, you have to look at all the different kinds of disciplines to understand what's going on. You need to understand the plants, the animals, the geology, the climate, as well as the culture. The interdisciplinary approach has become very prominent in our field today. Well, I think I'm getting to maybe a point where maybe we could ask, if somebody wants to ask me any questions about what I've said, others, I'll start out on this side and then I'll work over to this side, okay?
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Liam Gleason. I'm pretty new to Bandon, and I actually my PhD in biological and cultural anthropology, so thank you for this talk. I'm curious to what the contemporary relationship is between Bandon and the tribes, especially within cultural heritage preservation.
That's an interesting question. I'm under contract with the tribe. This book that I'm working on is being financed by the tribe. And so I am an employee, so I might want to be careful what I say. But we do face some interesting challenges here, don't we? Two of them are the development of the Marriott Hotel in downtown Bandon, and the other one is the Gravel Point. Actually, it's Grave Point. That's what the original name for that point was, but it was changed to Gravel Point because the developer thought, well, if we keep the name as Grave Point, somebody might think there's Indians buried there. So they changed the name. Well, they probably are right about that. There probably are people buried there. There are people buried in a lot of places in Bandon. From a tribal perspective, the tribe does not want to see their ancestors disturbed. I guess my analogy for that would be, let's just say that the Marriott Hotel decided that maybe they would like to build a hotel up there on the Pioneer Cemetery, right next to where the baseball field is. How would we feel about that? Now, the developer would say, well, we can just dig up the bodies, move them to a different location. Would you be happy if you were told that? Or would you want that cemetery to be left untouched? That's the answer I give you for that one.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Back there, I guess. Go ahead.
Hi, Reg. This might be on the cultural side. Were any of the Indian kids subjected to the boarding school situation, or did that all take place?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I attended a funeral for one of those children that was reburied over at the tribal cemetery at Empire recently. That's really a tragic story.
Oh, yeah.
And there were probably thousands of young Indian children that were subjected to extreme abuse in basically church managed schools, where the idea was to take away all of the native influence and turn these people into model citizens who would speak only English and would know how to be domestics or do some kind of work, meaningful work, but they would not be savages anymore. And I don't find very many happy stories looking at those schools. That's a dark part of American history, but it's also a very dark part of Canadian history. Canada has as much responsibility for abusing Native Americans as the United States does, or in some cases it's even worse. Yes?
Well, I've heard that people from this area, Native people, were rounded up and forced north, and they were forbidden from speaking their native language. I just want to know if that's true.
That is definitely true.
Okay.
But there are some, we like to think about the Native story as just being about genocide. But it isn't really totally that way. For example, they rounded up several hundred people from here and took them to reservations at Yachats and Siletz and Grand Ronde in the Willamette Valley. But there were a surprising number of people who didn't have to go. There were women who married white men and became citizens, and they weren't removed to reservations. There were people who, for some reason, escaped attention, moved into the backcountry, and were able to stay here without leaving. And there were even white people here, like Adam Pershbaker, who provided refuge for 30 people from the Coquel tribe that came here in 1870 to escape the reservation. And the army was going to round them up and take them back, and he petitioned the government to allow him to take care of those people. And he had a sawmill and a cannery at Randolph Island near Rocky Point. And those people were employed in his sawmill and his canneries, salmon canneries. And so they were able to stay too. And most of those people were able to get allotments, which is like a homestead for Indians, and became citizens and fit into white culture. There were families like the Cronenbergs that employed Indian women. Mrs. Cronenberg was fascinated by the stories of a woman whose name was Gwalia, who was born here in 1830. And she wrote down a lot of those stories, and they even had a pageant here where they reenacted some of those stories back in the early 1900s. So it wasn't always bad. There were good white people here who tried to protect Native Americans. And I like to tell the whole story. I don't think it's fair to say that everyone was bad, because they weren't.
Was it primarily federal government, or was it federal and state that were
Well,
removing people?
There were both federal and state efforts to remove Indians. My great-great-grandfather was a dragoon at Fort Lane in 1854, and went on an expedition to punish the Modocs over near Klamath Lake. And he captured a young Indian boy during that expedition and raised him as his own child. But I'm sure he committed atrocities on that expedition as well. So there were these state volunteers that worked with federal soldiers who generally came from the East and were oftentimes quite well educated and had a completely different viewpoint of the Native Americans. The state volunteers wanted to exterminate the Indians. The federal army, led by people like Armstrong, Custer, and others, did not have that desire to wipe out Indian culture completely.
Why is it that we refer to it as the city and the river Coquille, but the people Coquelle?
Well, that's a confusing question. When I was growing up here, we never used the word Coquelle. It was always Coquille. And the French have a word, coquille, that means shell. And I always thought, well, that must have been a word that was given to these villages, the shell people, because they have these big mounds of shells on the outside of their houses where they discarded them when they were cooking. But after 1945, the name Coquille City, it was Coquelle before, but after the war, everybody wanted to call it Coquille City, so they changed the pronunciation of it. That's one explanation. Probably the original name of the Coquille River was the Eel River, the Sequitz River. But the tribe has chosen a more native-sounding pronunciation for their tribe. And so it's tough to go back and forth. You're talking about the Coquille River, but you're talking about the Coquelle people, and it's hard to keep from making mistakes and saying the wrong thing. I spend a lot of time with Indian people and attend a lot of their ceremonies and listen to their stories and try to fit in as much as I can. But I love that show Yellowstone. I don't know if you guys watch that or not, but and there's the grandfather talking to his son-in-law, and he says, "We are not your people. Mm-hmm. They are their people and we are our people. But we can coexist and enjoy the company of each other." Sometimes I wonder if we're heading in that direction or not now.
The grandmother rock where Heritage Living Space is now, that was destroyed. Was there any culture about what would happen to an area to people who destroyed that rock, or
Well,
any
that's
stories
one of
about
those,
that?
that's one of those persistent myths that comes up occasionally, that the Indians said that Bandon had burned 2 times, and because we destroyed that rock, it would burn again.
Yeah.
Now, Coquel Thompson, who was an informant for several anthropologists, talked about a giant fire that took place about 1845 here. And it came down the river, it followed the river down and burned all the villages and forced everybody that survived to go out into the ocean so they could survive. So there have been fires here before we arrived, and there will be fires here after we leave, probably. And some of those fires were crown fires. I think if you look at the Coquille Valley, you see this low hills on both sides, and then there's the river, which is basically at sea level. And if you get a fire started to the east of here, it's going to follow, and you got an east wind pushing it, and it's going to follow the river right down to the ocean. Now, Brookings almost burned a few years ago because of something like that, and that could very well happen here too. So when we talk about natural disasters, you know, there are a lot of different kinds of things to talk about. The original Nasoma village at the mouth of the river was destroyed in 1700 by a giant tidal wave. And the village was never occupied again because everybody said that we won't live there anymore because it's too dangerous. That's where they want to build the Marriott Hotel. You know, you would think that we would learn from those kinds of natural disasters because they will happen again. Fires will come back,
Yeah.
earthquakes will happen, tidal waves will happen, floods will happen. And in our short lifetime, we can't see the breadth of what happens here.
The 1700 earthquake was the orphan tidal wave in Japan, and that was the last level 9 earthquake in this area.
That's right, and it might have been the largest earthquake that ever happened here.
Uh-huh.
There was another one that happened here about 900 years earlier than that. I don't think it was as devastating.
Right. Right, okay, well, when we're overdue for one.
Well, we could happen at any time.
Right.
That's for sure. Go ahead. I'm probably not getting everybody that wants to ask questions, but.
And Reg, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've listened to you before a lot, and it fascinated me that in Bandon there wasn't just one Indian village. There was one like at Coquille Point. There was one at Double's Kitchen, one where the pizza parlor sits, one where, and I just find that extremely fascinating that they all had their own little villages and they didn't like work together to try to do something. And a lot of people didn't know other people in other villages that were like less than a mile away from them. Is that true?
Well, they probably knew those people.
Right.
And there was quite a bit of intermarriage that took place. And you had to marry outside your own clan, your own lineage. So everybody in a village was generally related to each other. So you couldn't marry somebody in that village. You'd have to go to a different village to marry out, as they say.
I read about a miner's attack on some of the Nasoma native people. And where would that have been if is it where the Nasoma Village Memorial is?
No, that site was abandoned in 1700 and never reoccupied. But the village that was attacked was the one that was over on River Road, just a little bit to the east of where the sewage treatment plant is.
Okay.
And There were 15 men and 2 women that were killed in that massacre at that site.
Yeah, and they were just sleeping. at
Well,
night.
they were sleeping and they set fire to their houses, and as they came out from the doorway, they shot everyone that stepped out, all the males anyway.
And it was completely, there was no provocation for it.
Well, there had been incidents, but they were not major.
Thanks.
So, I heard you mention this off of the subject, we've been talking about, but the oak trees and the acorns
Mhm.
here in the past. And from a talk I heard you do years ago, you talked about how at one time, say 5,000 years ago, this was oak savanna.
Yeah.
Because the Cascades had not risen, so
Mhm.
Cascades came up, oaks went away, but the presence of oak trees here, have they been here since that?
Well,
That happened, or?
that's a good question, and we spend a lot of time discussing that. You know, we have lots of myrtle trees here. And the myrtle nuts were used for food, but they were not especially popular. But they were mixed with the acorns from other types of oak trees that were desirable, like tan oaks and white oaks. And as I'm writing this book, I find that there are a lot of things that need to be corrected. People say that there are no oaks in the Coquille Valley. I found evidence for large groves of white oaks at Arago, which is just, 15 miles to the east of us here. There were probably no tan oaks or white oaks growing right here in Bandon because it was a little bit too wet. But you didn't have to go very far upriver to find lots of oaks. And most anthropologists have not talked about the idea that the river is a unifying force. I've spent a lot of time on that river, looking for archaeological sites and fishing or duck hunting or that kind of thing. So I've explored all the different branches of it. And the river is, even today, you can get a boat almost all the way up to Myrtle Point.
Mm.
It was like a highway, a super highway. And before the whites came, the river was much deeper than it is today, and navigability could have been halfway to Powers on the South Fork and halfway up the East Fork and all the way up to Fairview on the North Fork. So the people that lived here had this incredible highway at their doorstep so that they could access interior resources as well as coastal resources. There's something called tarweed that grew in abundance on the upper Coquille River. And oftentimes it's called Indian oats. And it was gathered every fall through a practice of burning the fields and then collecting the seeds. Just like the oats that we eat in our diets today, really nutritious. And that's been completely neglected in terms of the anthropological writings. I'm as interested in the hunting, fishing, and gathering practices of the people as I am in their material culture and their marriage practices and those kind of things. Because what you eat is a big part of what you are, in my opinion.
I'm wondering if you know anything, if there's any evidence about sort of sustainable ways of kind of beefing up the fishery. Like, for example, up in further north in Pacific Northwest from the Olympic Peninsula up north, there are things that are called marine gardens, and particularly clam gardens. In other cultures, there are fish ponds and things like that. I'm wondering if there is any evidence of anything like that around here.
I haven't seen anything like that. The only thing that would come close to that is that the native people here did a lot of weir fishing. The Coquille estuary was considerably larger before we came, and now it's pretty much filled in. But at one time there were fish traps or weirs all across the valley floor, along every tributary of the river. And those weirs could have been used for what you're talking about, for marine gardens. And I remember looking at a weir maybe 20 years ago, and it was all covered with barnacles. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? These weirs probably attract fish, you know, like perch or something like that feed on barnacles. And so the fish trap was an attraction to bring those fish in where they could be caught. And those weirs could also have been used to repair damage to sloughs if there was an erosional feature that would cause the fish to behave in a different way. That could have happened too. But yeah, to see to the north, there are definitely places where they actually have created with stone walls those kinds of places, but not here as far as I know.
Okay. Thanks.
We've always underestimated the impact of Native Americans on the landscape from both a positive and a negative viewpoint. You know, we like to imagine that they had a Hiawatha type lifestyle, living in harmony with nature. But then if we examine our own hearts and realize, do we behave that way ourselves? Probably not. And humans have been accused of causing the extinction of the megafauna, you know, mastodons and mammoths and those kind of things by overhunting, even in prehistoric times. So everything here has been manipulated by humans and changed. Just gathering, say, roots up here on the Bandon Prairie would have changed the composition of the species that was growing here. And that's what humans do. They change the environment. For the most part, we have tried to change the environment to better ourselves. I think that this culture today, though, has actually gone in the other direction and is destroying the place that it calls home.
I just want to comment that when white people got here, the rivers and tributaries were full of salmon, even with all that harvesting that had gone on. In other words, what a contrast. In 150 years, we're dealing with extinction out here, salmon extinction. And I don't know, I think about that a lot, that the Indians were here harvesting for thousands of years.
Well,
When we got here, it was lush with salmon.
You're right that we have really damaged this ecosystem, but there is something else that's taken place here too that we have to take into consideration, and that is climate change. And this drought that we're in now, across most people would agree that we're in a drought, in the West especially, probably started about 1850, and it's gradually getting stronger all the time. And it causes things like what happened in Los Angeles. And those events are going to get worse unless we change the way we behave. And there may be nothing we can do, but the salmon populations in 1850 were probably at a peak. There had been a little ice age that lasted for about 400 years before, and so all the rivers were running with lots of water in them. And salmon and water go together. When you have a drought, you're not going to have salmon. And we can see that, the effects of that even here in Bandon now. Whether the climate changes back to the way it used to be or not, it probably is not going to happen in our lifetime. And it may not ever happen again. We won't know because we won't be here to see it, but okay, getting close? Okay, I'm getting tired too. Well, you know, I mean, I'm constantly looking for new information. I spend an awful lot of time reading, and a lot of the reading is in stuff that probably most people wouldn't find very interesting, archaeological reports, and looking for clues, anything to expand my knowledge of this place. And as I find myself reaching the ending of my intellectual capabilities, I realize that won't continue on for too much longer. But I'll keep trying.